As Tim said, I'm Ellen Miller, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Sunlight Foundation, and I am delighted to be here and have an opportunity to have a conversation, a public conversation with my colleague Vivek Kundra. We're going to pretend as if we're just in his office in the OMB, and we're going to let you in because, of course, we're both advocates of transparency. Vivek and I also agree on some very core elements of what transparency means. For sure, we agree that data means is key to understanding what happens in government. It's important for citizens to be able to get their hands on it, and we agree that it's also a platform for government for all kinds of things that can be built on top of it. We also agree that public data means online. I mean, this is the 21st century. Where else would we go to get our information? And the one element that Sunlight would add, and I haven't asked Vivek whether he agrees with this, is the notion that data needs to be online in real time. So when we get reports from government that are 6 months old or even 4 months old, we're always behind the curve. And so part of Sunlight's attempt in our work is to move government to not only data online, but in real time. So I want to start by asking Vivek a question about his sort of overall philosophy, which we talk a lot about at Sunlight, which is government's role. A lot of us see government's role as a wholesaler of data, not a retailer of it. Where does Vivek Kundra come down on that question?
So I think it's a little bit of both. If you think about the foundation that the President has been talking about, a foundation built on transparency and open government, it's very important, one, for the government to make sure that it democratizes data, it makes information available publicly in a machine-readable format. Second, also, it's important to also display in a mechanism where the American people can understand what's happening with that data. But where I would agree 100% with you is that on the wholesaler notion, that's far more important than figuring out how you slice and dice and aggregate and present that information. What we've found is that people, the American people, are going to be able to do that far better than individuals who are essentially focused on presenting one side of a position. So I think we need to make sure that, one, we are democratizing data, but secondly, that the government has a responsibility to present what it sees. A perfect example of that would be what we did with the IT dashboard, where we took information around IT investments across the federal government, over $76 billion. We made sure that the data was available in raw machine-readable format, but we also showed the American people how we were using it to make decisions around investments. That's great.
And I think that's exactly where government should be, which is, give it to us in the raw form, and then you can then tools can be built on top of it. So that's terrific. While you mentioned the IT dashboard, which is built on top of Spendinggov, let me jump to that as a question. I have a particular interest in Spendinggov since it was built on top of a database that Sunlight funded called fedspending.org. I should add, it was built at the cost, substantially more cost. The original database cost $320,000 to build, and I don't know what the total expenditure is for Spendinggov, but I know the appropriation was $12 million. Put that aside. We can talk about costs later. What's next for Spendinggov? How do we get the information that is cleaner, without mistakes, more quickly? What are your plans for this database on government grants and contracts?
Part of what we're trying to do is we want to make sure that we get data out there on as real-time a basis as possible. But just to manage expectations, it's also very important to understand that the infrastructure that a lot of these agencies run on, whether it's the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, or whether you look at some of the agencies within HHS or DOD, a lot of those agencies have aging systems. They're built on COBOL infrastructure. They're built on infrastructure that can't handle the demand, especially when you put out that information in the public domain. So what's happening is there's a transformation going on the back end as we address some of the really difficult challenges. Second, what we want to do is we want to make sure there's a cultural change within the federal government to make sure that if you think about the data supply chain, for far too long, there are too many intermediaries who want to clean up the data before it's out there in the public domain. A perfect example would be the IT dashboard. When we started putting out the data there, everyone argued that, look, the data is not 100% accurate. We haven't made sure that we've included these other 5 elements that are required. We made the decision to put it out there, and we noticed within 30 days, the data quality started improving because people told us where the gaps were, rather than spending years cleaning up that information. So it's a combination of real technology investments that need to happen on the back end, coupled with cultural change within the federal government to make sure that people understand they're okay with releasing some of that information. Now, what compounds this issue, by the way, is obviously there's federal statutes that mandate that the data that the government puts out there, there's a data quality requirement, that the data quality is accurate, especially when you're talking about information that could fundamentally move, whether it's markets, such as unemployment numbers, or data that could change what's going on in terms of investments that are happening all across the country.
Data.gov, switching agencies or switching websites, Data.gov has to be one of your signature accomplishments, and it's a huge one. And I want to congratulate you for it. You have set as your metric numbers of data feeds. You certainly achieved your first metric of 100,000 in the first 6 months of operation. That's fabulous, but a lot of those contain information that has already been online. Basically, you picked the low-hanging fruit, and you put it online, and nobody got hurt, and it all looks terrific. What are your plans for expanding that to data that might in some cases not be quite so easily available, or data that might have a more meaningful impact, toxic release data, for example, or data that might come from the FDA? What are your plans for getting into more of the meat of data that citizens might actually have an intense interest in?
Sure. So our view is that data.gov is the first brick when you think of transparency and open government. What it is it's a platform, as we talk about government as a platform, to really put out information out there across the spectrum in terms of the operations of government. And what we need to do now, in terms of as we look forward, is to shift from technology and to shift away from the notion that we're putting out all these data feeds that are machine readable, and really address some of the toughest issues this country faces and move this debate towards public policy. A perfect example would be as we think about information-driven markets. If you and I wanted to go out there and buy a camera today, we could go online and we could compare the price of a camera. We could look at how many megapixels each camera had, the aperture size. Same thing with a car. But if you think of the healthcare industry, how do you power that industry through data so you could have the same ability to drive comparative effectiveness, to be able to compare one hospital to another, or be able to compare what's going on in terms of outcomes, whether that has to do with drugs or whether that has to do with devices across the board. Energy, same public policy issue, which is how do you compare and effectively make public policy decisions that are data-driven. And we also recognize that the federal government does not have a monopoly on the best ideas. And how do we fundamentally change the way the American people interact with the federal government? How do we get people to give us better ideas in terms of solving some of these really, really difficult public policy issues? As soon as we launched data.gov, the Sign Life Foundation launched a competition called Apps for America 2, and the winners were announced. And what we saw as a result of the applications that were built, we always knew that the true value lied at the intersection of multiple data feeds. And we noticed that the winner was an organization that created Data Masher. And it essentially allows you to look at the intersection of what's going on in terms of your address with what's happening in terms of voting on the Hill, and looking at data that has to do with healthcare and what's going on in terms of investments. Across the board, we're thinking about this as a huge platform that has a potential not just to make sure that the American people are watchdogs, but also as innovators and people who could introduce game-changing technologies that could fundamentally change the way their government works.
So the metric really is use of the data. It's really the platform of the data. But where are we going in terms of adding data feeds? What's next? What can we look forward to?
And so what's next there? So when we launched, we were at 47 data feeds. And today we're over 110,000 data feeds that are out there on data.gov. Where we're headed as part of the Open Government Directive that's forthcoming is to actually make sure that we hardwire releasing data as part of the agency culture, so that agencies across the board are able to publish data out there, but also making sure that it's not just the volume of data and data feeds that are out there. What we have to do is make sure that we introduce data sets that could shift the debate in the country around public policy. So not every data feed is created equally. A data feed around healthcare or energy or education may be far more valuable than a data feed data that shows you press releases. So what we're doing is now, in terms of phase 2 of data.gov, is going after those very difficult public policy issues that are going to take time, and we're going to have to deliberate over how we make those public without violating the privacy or security of the American people.
That sounds good, and I certainly would agree with you. I teased Vivek a couple of weeks ago about the latest set of data feeds that I saw on data.gov had to do with press releases and statements of officials from the Defense Department, as I recall. And I think we're all very interested in the kind of data that informs public policy, both from a citizen participation point of view as well as from a government decision-making point of view. Talk to us a little bit about Open ID. What's happening in the government with respect to Open ID?
So when we talk about platforms across the board, one of the things we have to recognize is that the United States government continues to invest in platforms that maybe it shouldn't be investing in. A perfect example would be with over 20,000 plus websites in the government. If you wanted to go out there today and make a reservation for a camping site, the Department of Interior through recreations.gov would actually force you to create an account, and you would use it once maybe or a couple of times, and you would never be able to use it again. Same thing if you went to the NIH, if you went to GSA, if you went to CDC, you could name every single agency. And what it does is it leads to, one, poor service. Second, it leads to higher cost because a lot of that infrastructure is disposable in general. So one of the things that we've been talking about is, well, how do we leverage platforms that already exist? If we think about the American people and our customers as far as access to information, they may already have an account with whether it's Yahoo or Google or Microsoft or Facebook. Why not leverage those platforms for services that are not sensitive in nature and services that essentially are disposable in some ways as far as use is concerned? So we're working very closely. We've been working with the Open ID Foundation to look at how we can create a trust framework across the federal government with the providers of Open ID to be able to authenticate and allow people to have access to some of the government services. What this will allow us to do is move from websites on the federal government end that are brochureware to actually very interactive, service-driven sites that the American people can use within their own context.
Terrific. That's a great development. All right. We have time for just maybe one or two quick questions, although maybe there's not a quick answer to this. The cost of government IT, again, something squarely in your bailiwick. Can you explain to us why the redesign of Recovery.gov will cost $8.5 million this year and $14 million over the course of 4 years? It is incomprehensible, I think, to the average American, much less many folks who toil in the technology field. What's the reason for this enormous cost?
So the Recovery Board is leading the effort in terms of going through and implementing Recovery.gov. So what I can say from our perspective in terms of thinking through some of these costs is we have to also recognize that, one, this has never been done before at this scale. In terms of the $787+ billion being tracked at a national level, at the federal, state, local level, every county you can think of, every state you can think of, and building that infrastructure and making sure that that data is collected. Now, I can't speak to, obviously, the specifics of how the Recovery Board went through the evaluation, but what I can say is the scale at which this is being done is enormous, and it's never been done historically. The second thing I would say overall in terms of federal IT, and this is where I think initiatives like Data.gov are very important, and the IT dashboard. What we're trying to do is bring about transparency, make sure that people can see where federal IT spending is going, and also give us the ability or point us to a third way, a better way of doing things. So you look at some of these investments that are being made across the federal government, and if we look at the history of federal IT, it's littered with spectacular failures. And I've been spending a lot of time with CIOs across the world, whether it's CIOs from Canada, the UK, Australia, Mexico, to name a few, and looking at some of the best practices across the board. And this is not uncommon to the United States only. But what we need to do is we need to figure out game-changing ways of solving these problems. And Data.gov as a platform is one example. But also, that's one of the reasons we're moving towards a cloud computing strategy across the federal government to make sure that we could lower the cost of government operations and ensure that we're not spending money, we're not spending millions of dollars where we could solve the same problem for thousands. A perfect example that I talk about is a blog that was about to be launched at TSA. And people were debating about, well, how do we implement this? And they talked about FISMA security requirements, procuring all of this infrastructure, hosting it in data centers, making sure that we had security embedded in, on those servers and also the network itself. And the bill came to $600,000. And wiser minds prevailed, and they decided to say, well, wait a second, we could just host this for free online. So those are some of the decisions that we want to make sure are, one, changed, and also looking at the investments. That's one of the reasons we moved aggressively as a first step, launching the IT dashboard and putting all the data out in the public domain. And we've been getting tremendous feedback. And as soon as we went live with the IT dashboard, you saw what happened at the VA. Roger Baker and General Shinseki temporarily halted 45 IT projects they were concerned about. Across the board, the Federal CIO Council is evaluating all these projects to make sure that taxpayer dollars are spent well.
Terrific. Well, we are out of time. Vivek is what I think of as a rock star of government data, so he deserves that kind of applause. Thanks, Vivek.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen.